The body does not wait for permission. It never has. Before language, before reasoning, before identity, there was movement. Yet now you hesitate, negotiating with thoughts as if they hold authority. They do not. The delay you feel is not confusion, it is resistance embedded in comfort. A disciplined life begins where agreement ends. When the alarm sounds, the body must rise before the mind constructs its excuses. When the task appears, the hands must engage before doubt organizes its arguments. This is not intensity. It is order. You have been trained to believe clarity comes first. It does not. Action comes first. Clarity is extracted from motion, not granted in advance. Each time you wait to feel ready, you reinforce hesitation as identity. Each time you move without consensus, you fracture that identity. This is the shift, from thinking about discipline to becoming the one who moves without needing to think. Movement is the first betrayal of your current self. That is why you resist it. The moment your body begins before your mind agrees, something fractures, an internal hierarchy collapses. You are no longer governed by preference, mood, or internal negotiation. You are governed by command. Most people never experience this shift. They live inside a loop, thought, hesitation, justification, delay. It feels intelligent. It feels controlled. But it is a closed system. Nothing enters, nothing changes. The body remains still, and so does the life attached to it. When you force movement without agreement, you interrupt that loop. The brain scrambles to catch up, to explain what is already happening. This is where discipline is formed, not in deciding, but in overriding the need to decide. Consider the moment your alarm sounds. There is a window, small, almost invisible. Inside that window, there is no story yet. No fatigue, no reasoning, no negotiation. Only a signal. If you move in that window, you bypass the identity that would have kept you in place. If you hesitate, even for seconds, the narrative begins constructing itself. Just a few more minutes, you need rest, start later. These are not thoughts. They are defenses. The body must become faster than the narrative. This is why physical action is the entry point. You do not think your way into discipline. You step into it. You stand up, you walk, you begin. The mind follows, reluctantly at first, then obediently. Over time, it stops resisting because resistance is no longer effective. There is a cost to this. The first repetitions feel unnatural, mechanical, even hostile. You will feel a split between what you are doing and what you feel like doing. That split is not a problem. It is evidence. It shows that your actions are no longer controlled by impulse. Most people interpret this discomfort as misalignment. They stop. They return to waiting for motivation, for clarity, for the right emotional state. But that state never arrives consistently. So their life becomes inconsistent. You are not aligning action with feeling. You are replacing feeling with action. This does not mean you become rigid or blind. It means you establish a sequence, movement first, evaluation later. Once in motion, you can adjust, refine, redirect. But you cannot refine what does not exist. Stillness produces nothing to shape. Watch those who rely on motivation. Their energy spikes, then collapses. Their commitments expand, then dissolve. They are always beginning, rarely continuing. Because they require agreement each time. You remove that requirement. The body moves because it is time to move. Not because it feels correct. Not because it is convenient. Not because the mind approves. This is the foundation. From here, identity begins to shift. Not through belief, but through repetition under resistance. Each time you act without agreement, you send a signal, this is what we do. Eventually, the mind stops questioning. Not because it understands, but because it has lost authority. And in that loss, something else takes its place. What takes its place is not motivation. It is structure. Once the body learns to move without permission, a new order begins to form, one that does not rely on internal dialogue. The mind is no longer the gatekeeper. It becomes an observer, then eventually an instrument. This transition is subtle, but it is absolute. At first, the mind protests. It questions the timing, the necessity, the intensity. It attempts to reassert control through doubt. But each time the body moves anyway, that resistance weakens. Not because it is resolved, but because it is ignored. This is how authority is reassigned. Understand this clearly: the mind is designed to conserve energy, not to pursue growth. It prioritizes familiarity, not expansion. When you wait for it to agree, you are submitting to a system built to keep you unchanged. Movement disrupts that system. This is why discipline must be physical before it becomes cognitive. You are not convincing yourself to act. You are acting in spite of the need for conviction. There is no negotiation in this process. Negotiation implies equality between thought and action. There is none. Action leads. Thought follows. When this order is repeated, something stabilizes. You begin to experience a form of internal silence, not because the mind has nothing to say, but because its voice no longer determines behavior. The noise remains, but it loses consequence. This is where most people become uncomfortable. Without internal permission, they feel exposed. There is no justification to hide behind, no emotional alignment to rely on. Only execution. Only movement. This strips away illusion. You see clearly what you do and do not do. And that clarity is unforgiving. If the body does not move, there is no excuse left to protect identity. If it does move, there is no need for validation. The action stands alone. This is the threshold where discipline becomes visible. Not in intensity. Not in performance. But in consistency without emotional support. You wake up and move. You begin and continue. You execute without waiting for readiness. Over time, this repetition builds a pattern the mind cannot override. It adapts. It reorganizes itself around behavior instead of directing it. This is the inversion. Instead of thinking your way into action, you act your way into thought. The mind starts to anticipate movement rather than resist it. It begins to align, not because it was persuaded, but because resistance is no longer effective. This is not harmony. It is submission. And from that submission, efficiency emerges. Decisions become shorter. Transitions become sharper. There is less friction between intention and execution because intention is no longer debated. You remove the delay. Most lives are defined by that delay, the space between knowing and doing. That space is where identity decays, where plans dissolve, where potential remains abstract. You close that space with movement. Not once. Repeatedly. Until there is no gap left to occupy. At that point, discipline is no longer something you practice. It is something that operates. What operates now is not effort. It is enforcement. By the time you reach this stage, the question of whether is no longer present. There is only when, and even that begins to dissolve. The body does not consult the mind for confirmation. It executes based on pattern, and that pattern has been carved through repetition under resistance. This is where most people misunderstand discipline. They believe it becomes easier. It does not. The resistance still appears, but it arrives too late. The body is already in motion. The sequence has already begun. The window for hesitation no longer exists. You have removed access. In earlier stages, resistance had time to build structure. It could develop arguments, layer emotion, reinforce identity. Now, it is cut off at the root. The moment it appears, it is already irrelevant. Action has overridden it before it can stabilize. This creates a different internal environment. Not calm. Not comfort. Precision. There is a directness to your behavior. You wake, movement. You see the task, initiation. You encounter difficulty, continuation. There is no internal debate stretching across minutes or hours. The delay has been eliminated, and with it, the illusion of choice. This is where identity fully shifts. You are no longer someone who tries to be disciplined. You are someone whose behavior does not require permission. That distinction is absolute. One depends on circumstances. The other operates regardless of them. But this level introduces a new pressure. Without hesitation, there is nothing to buffer you from reality. Your output becomes visible in its raw form. If you execute poorly, it is clear. If you fall short, it is exposed. There is no narrative delay to soften it. This is where many retreat. They reintroduce thinking as a shield. They slow down. They begin to question again, not because they need to, but because questioning creates distance from outcome. Distance feels safer. But safety is regression. To maintain this state, you must continue to move before evaluation. Refinement happens after execution, never instead of it. If you reverse that order, the system collapses back into hesitation. This is the maintenance of discipline, protecting sequence. Action adjustment. Never adjustment action. The body initiates. The mind refines. Not the other way around. Over time, this creates a form of trust, not emotional trust, but structural reliability. You know that when something must be done, it will be done. Not because you feel capable, but because you no longer require that feeling. This removes a layer of instability most people never escape. They rely on internal states that fluctuate. You rely on a system that does not. And within that system, there is no space for negotiation. Only execution, followed by correction, followed by continued execution. This is where output compounds. Not through intensity, but through uninterrupted sequence. No resets. No waiting for the right moment. No dependency on mood. Just repeated cycles of movement that build upon each other without break. The result is not dramatic in a single moment. It is cumulative, quiet, relentless. And because it is quiet, most people overlook it. They search for visible struggle, for bursts of effort, for signs of force. They do not recognize the absence of hesitation as the true signal. But that absence is everything. Because once hesitation is removed, nothing remains to stop you except physical limitation. And even that becomes something you engage with directly, not something you avoid through delay. At this point, discipline is no longer a practice. It is a condition. And conditions do not negotiate. The condition holds only if it is reinforced under variation. Repetition in a controlled environment is not enough. Anyone can execute when conditions are stable, when variables are minimized, when friction is predictable. But real pressure enters through disruption, fatigue, interruption, unpredictability. This is where the system is tested. If your discipline depends on ideal conditions, it is not discipline. It is compliance. The body must move even when the structure around it shifts. When timing changes, when energy drops, when external noise increases, the sequence must remain intact. Not perfectly, but consistently. The action still comes first. This is where rigidity becomes a risk. If you attach discipline to a fixed routine without adaptability, disruption will break it. The system must be flexible in form, but rigid in sequence. The method can change. The order cannot. Movement adjustment. If the environment changes, you do not pause to reconstruct the perfect approach. You initiate with what is available. Reduced intensity, altered timing, limited resources, it does not matter. The body still moves. This preserves continuity. Most people fail here. Not because they cannot act, but because they cannot tolerate imperfect execution. They would rather wait for optimal conditions than proceed under constraint. But waiting is the reintroduction of delay. And delay rebuilds hesitation. You cannot protect both comfort and momentum. When conditions degrade, the identity is revealed. Either you maintain sequence, or you revert to negotiation. There is no middle state. This is why discipline must detach from outcome quality in the moment of action. Quality is addressed after. Execution is protected during. You begin even if it is incomplete. You continue even if it is inefficient. You finish even if it is flawed. Then you refine. This creates durability. Your system no longer collapses under pressure because it was never dependent on ease. It was built through interruption, through resistance, through variation. The body has learned to operate across conditions, not within a narrow range of them. This is where consistency becomes unbreakable. Not because nothing interferes, but because interference no longer stops initiation. You have removed the requirement for a clear path. You move through obstruction instead of around it. This introduces a different kind of fatigue. Not physical exhaustion, but structural strain. The demand to maintain sequence under all conditions creates pressure. There is no off switch based on mood. No exemption based on inconvenience. This is intentional. Because exemption is where identity weakens. The moment you allow exception based on internal state, you reopen negotiation. And once negotiation returns, hesitation follows. To prevent this, the rule must remain simple and absolute: the body moves first. Even if the movement is small. Even if it is partial. Even if it is the minimum viable action. The scale can adjust. The sequence cannot. This preserves identity under stress. You are no longer evaluating whether you will act. You are determining how you will continue acting within constraint. That distinction removes collapse points. And over time, constraint becomes normal. You stop expecting ideal conditions. You stop requiring clarity before movement. You stop measuring readiness as a prerequisite. You begin where you are, with what is available, under whatever condition exists. That is the extension of discipline beyond structure. It is no longer tied to time, place, or environment. It becomes portable. It follows you into unpredictability, into disruption, into environments where most systems fail. And in those environments, the separation becomes visible. Not in effort, not in intention, but in continuity. One continues. The other resets. What separates continuation from collapse is not intensity, but non-negotiation at the point of friction. By segment 5, the system is no longer fragile. It has survived repetition, interruption, and variation. But a deeper layer of resistance begins to appear, less obvious, more internal, more calculated. It does not try to stop you at the beginning. It waits until you are already in motion. This is strategic resistance. It appears mid-action. It suggests slowing down, adjusting standards prematurely, cutting sequences short. It does not say stop. It says this is enough. And because you are already moving, it feels reasonable. This is where many lose structure without realizing it. They still act. They still begin. But they no longer complete at the required level. The sequence weakens not at initiation, but at continuation. The body starts, but it does not carry through with the same authority. This is a higher level failure. Because it hides inside compliance. From the outside, nothing looks broken. Tasks are being done. Movement is happening. But internally, the standard has shifted. The body is no longer enforcing completion, it is negotiating the depth of execution. That negotiation must be removed. The same rule applies, movement first. But now extended, movement continues without reduction until the defined endpoint is reached. Not the convenient endpoint. The real one. This requires a different kind of awareness. Not emotional awareness. Structural awareness. You must detect when the mind attempts to re-enter control, not at the beginning, but during execution. It will not challenge the act of starting anymore. It will challenge how far you go. This is where discipline becomes precision. You are not just initiating action. You are maintaining its integrity across the full sequence. No shortening. No silent compromise. No invisible adjustments that reduce output while preserving the appearance of effort. This is where identity is tested at a deeper level. Anyone can begin under pressure once trained. Fewer can maintain standard when fatigue, boredom, or monotony sets in. Because continuation does not have the same psychological intensity as starting. It is quieter, more repetitive, easier to dilute. But dilution is decay. Each time you reduce standard without cause, you introduce inconsistency. And inconsistency reopens the door to negotiation. Not immediately, but gradually. And once that door opens, the earlier stages begin to erode. So the enforcement extends. Start without agreement. Continue without reduction. Finish without exception. 3 points. No deviation. This creates a closed system of execution. There is no entry point for resistance because there is no phase where permission is required. Not at the start. Not in the middle. Not at the end. The body operates across the full arc. This is where output becomes reliable. Not because you feel consistent, but because the sequence is protected at every stage. Initiation, continuation, completion, each locked into the same rule set. And once this is stable, something changes again. You begin to experience less internal interference, not because resistance is gone, but because it has no functional role. It appears, but it cannot alter the sequence. It becomes background noise. This is where execution becomes quieter. There is less internal conflict, not because there is agreement, but because disagreement no longer matters. The system does not pause to resolve it. And in that silence, efficiency increases. You waste less time managing internal states. You spend less energy correcting hesitation. You move from one action to the next with minimal friction because there is no internal checkpoint requiring approval. This is the removal of internal bureaucracy. No meetings. No debates. No delays. Only sequence. And sequence, once uninterrupted, compounds faster than effort ever could. The system no longer struggles against resistance. It operates through it. But a different threat emerges here, not from hesitation, not from reduction, but from automation without awareness. Execution becomes smooth, predictable, efficient. The body moves on cue, completes sequences, maintains structure. From the outside, this looks like mastery. But internally, something begins to dull. Repetition without awareness creates drift. You are still executing, but the sharpness is gone. Movements become routine in the wrong way. Not disciplined, but unconscious. The system runs, but no longer tightens. No longer refines. No longer adapts. This is where discipline can decay at its highest level. Because now failure is not visible through inaction or inconsistency. It hides inside acceptable performance. You are doing what is required, but not with precision. Not with full engagement. The edge begins to soften. This is dangerous. Because it feels stable. There is no immediate consequence. Output still exists. Structure is still intact. But the standard is no longer being enforced with clarity. You are no longer confronting resistance, you are bypassing awareness. And without awareness, correction disappears. At this stage, the rule must evolve again. Not in sequence, but in intensity of attention. The body still moves first. That does not change. But now, while in motion, you must observe without interfering. You must detect inefficiency, looseness, deviation, not to stop action, but to refine it in real time or immediately after. This is not reflection. It is calibration. You do not pause to think. You register and adjust. Most people cannot do this. When they try to observe, they slow down. They break sequence. They reintroduce hesitation under the label of improvement. That is regression. The system must remain intact, action continues. Observation runs parallel. Adjustment follows without delay. 3 layers, operating simultaneously. Execution, observation, correction. If any layer dominates or replaces another, the system destabilizes. If you execute without observing, you drift. If you observe without executing, you stall. If you correct without completing, you fragment the sequence. All 3 must exist, but in order of priority. Execution leads. This creates a higher level of discipline, not just doing, but doing with controlled awareness that does not interrupt flow. The body moves. The mind tracks. The system adjusts. And this is where refinement becomes continuous. You are no longer waiting for a review point. You are no longer batching mistakes for later correction. Each repetition contains its own adjustment cycle. Small, precise, immediate. This prevents accumulation of error. Because uncorrected repetition builds flawed patterns. And flawed patterns, when repeated enough, become identity. At earlier stages, action alone was enough. Now, action must be accurate. Not perfect, but tightening. Each cycle reduces waste. Each sequence becomes more direct. Movements lose excess. Decisions shorten further. The system compresses. This is where efficiency becomes visible not just in output, but in form. There is less unnecessary motion. Less wasted energy. Less internal noise. Everything becomes sharper. But this sharpness must be maintained. Because comfort will attempt to return, not as hesitation, not as reduction, but as complacency with incompetence. You will feel capable, experienced, stable. That is when awareness must increase, not relax. Because discipline at this level is no longer built by forcing action. It is preserved by refusing to let action degrade. The standard is not just that you act. It is that you act cleanly. And clean execution requires constant pressure, not emotional, but structural. A refusal to allow looseness, even when results appear acceptable. This is the final layer before discipline becomes indistinguishable from identity. Where nothing is forced, but nothing is allowed to slip. Discipline is no longer something you apply. It is something that remains when everything unnecessary has been removed. There is no reliance on force, no visible strain, no internal escalation. The system holds without reinforcement because it has replaced what used to require reinforcement. But this is where the final distortion appears. Not hesitation. Not reduction. Not drift. Identification. You begin to see yourself as disciplined. And in that recognition, a subtle shift occurs. You protect the image instead of the sequence. You maintain behavior not because it is required, but because it confirms who you believe you are. This is the last vulnerability. Because identity, once formed, seeks stability. It resists disruption. It avoids situations that might expose inconsistency. And in doing so, it limits the very pressure that built it. You become selective. You execute where you are confident. You avoid where uncertainty exists. You maintain the areas that reinforce identity and neglect the ones that challenge it. From the outside, nothing appears broken. You are still consistent, still structured, still operating. But expansion stops. This is containment. Discipline becomes preservation instead of progression. To prevent this, identity must remain secondary. Always. The sequence is primary. Always. You do not act to confirm who you are. You act because the sequence requires it. even when it contradicts your current level, even when it exposes weakness, especially then. This reintroduces pressure, but of a different kind. Not the pressure to begin, not the pressure to continue, but the pressure to remain open to disruption, to allow the system to be tested in areas where it is not yet stable. This keeps discipline alive. Because discipline that is no longer challenged begins to decay into routine. And routine, when untested, becomes fragile again. So the rule extends one final time. Move before agreement. Continue without reduction. Finish without exception. Refine without delay. Expand without protection. Expansion is critical. You must deliberately enter environments where your current system is insufficient. New constraints. Higher complexity. Unfamiliar conditions. Not randomly, but intentionally. This prevents identity from closing. Because in those environments, you are no longer the one who has control. You are the one reapplying sequence under new pressure. The system is tested again, not from the beginning, but at the edge. And at the edge, discipline proves whether it is fixed or adaptable. If it is fixed, it breaks. If it is adaptable, it integrates. This is the final distinction. Not how well you operate within what you know, but how consistently you maintain sequence when what you know is no longer enough. There is no comfort here. No reinforcement. No confirmation. Only continuation under evolving pressure. And if the system holds there, without negotiation, without reduction, without identity protection, then discipline is no longer something you practice, refine, or even maintain. It is what remains when nothing else is allowed to interfere. There is no final moment where discipline announces itself as complete. No signal that confirms you have arrived. What remains instead is a pattern that no longer breaks. The body moves before the mind forms its objections. The sequence holds under variation, under fatigue, under pressure. Initiation happens without delay. Continuation holds without reduction. Completion lands without exception. Refinement follows without pause. Expansion removes any illusion of stability. Nothing in this system depends on how you feel. That is the separation. Most people live inside their internal conditions. When energy drops, they stop. When clarity fades, they wait. When resistance appears, they negotiate. Their actions are tied to states that shift constantly. You are no longer operating inside that structure. You move regardless of state. You execute regardless of clarity. You continue regardless of resistance. Not because you are stronger, but because you remove the requirement to feel ready. This is what remains when discipline is no longer something you attempt. There is no intensity in it. No visible force. No internal speeches. Only a consistent absence of hesitation, repeated across every phase of action. And that absence becomes decisive. Because without hesitation, there is no space for avoidance. Without avoidance, there is no accumulation of delay. Without delay, output becomes continuous. Not dramatic. Not explosive. Continuous. This is where separation becomes permanent. Not in what you say. Not in what you plan. In what continues. Everything else falls away. Only sequence remains.